Hello everyone, and today we're going to go over Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, Chapter 8, entitled Continental Imperialism, the Pan Movements. Now this is one of the longest chapters in the book, and there's a lot of material, so I'll do my best to explain it. Now, in previous chapter, we discussed imperialism that was overseas, or we call it the scramble for Africa. And then in this chapter, we're going to talk about a different imperialism called continental imperialism. Just like the name says, it's continental, which means it's in the continent of Europe. And it is imperialism that started in different countries in the continent, like Hungary, some of Russia, Austria, and more. According to Arendt, this continental imperialism was actually a reaction to people who didn't get their fair share in the scramble for Africa and thus wanted to expand. And they weren't in foreign lands, but they were in the continent, so they wanted to expand their presence in the continent of Europe. Now, while these imperialists were different, they were also the same in that they were both against the state. They saw the state as an obstacle that was getting in their way for their own expansion's sake. Quote, "The chief importance of continental, as distinguished from overseas imperialism, lies in the fact that its concept of cohesive expansion does not allow for any geographic distance between the methods and institutions of the colony and of the nation." So we're going to mark the differences between overseas imperialism and continental imperialism. And the first is the geographic characteristic of them. Continental imperialism starts at home. It's in the same land from which those nations see themselves as their kind of homegrown territory. Now, the second difference between overseas and continental imperialism is the driving will behind each of these imperialisms. For overseas imperialism, the will was motivated by economic expansion, basically money for money's own sake. Continental imperialism, on the other hand, didn't really care much about money. It cared about obtaining a national consciousness of the people, basically to unify the people under a single kind of folk community that they could all rally around. The third difference between continental and overseas imperialism is the relationship to the nation state. While it's true that both overseas and continental imperialism was against the nation state, overseas imperialism still required help from the nation state in order to secure the resources. Continental imperialism actually didn't need the nation state at all, and thus they were more prone to rebellious activity. In fact, continental imperialists remained hostile to all political bodies. They saw them as a way for them to basically get in the way of their own realization. And what is this realization? It's the ideology that their race is superior to other races. According to Arendt, this ideology, or this key to history, was immediately imminent at this point in time, particularly because people were in a socially atomized environment. They didn't feel like they had a sense of belonging where they were. Thus, an ideology provided them a solution. They could belong to this ideology and feel like they were a part of this race that was going to strive for excellence and superiority. Quote, "The point is that a complicated ideology in an organization which furthered no immediate interest proved to be more attractive than tangible advantages and commonplace convictions." In this way, the ideology of the continental imperialists wasn't grounded in reality itself. It was based fully on beliefs and ideas. Thus, it didn't really have any responsibility towards what was happening in the world. Now, this differs from overseas imperialism because they were driven by money and expanding in a geographic sense. Thus, continental imperialists could be motivated by actual material gains, whereas continental imperialists really just unified themselves around a mystical concept. Now, the fourth difference between continental and overseas imperialism is the key players that were behind these movements. Overseas imperialism, again, was motivated by money, and thus people who were basically guided towards this ideology for money were imperialists, people who wanted to make money, like Cecil Rhodes. Continental imperialism, on the other hand, again motivated by a national consciousness, pointed back to ancient times of Holy Russia or the Holy Roman Empire, and basically tried to build their base around these old myth histories that people could get excited about. According to Arendt, these intellectuals didn't have any ambition for national domination, but instead they were more guided towards creating a national spirit which was based and deep-rooted in the past. Quote, "Pseudo-mystical nonsense enriched by countless and arbitrary historical memories provided an emotional appeal that seemed to transcend in depth and breadth the limitations of nationalism. According to Arendt, this nationalism is a new type of nationalism, and she calls it tribal nationalism. Unlike chauvinism or other nationalisms, tribal nationalism isn't based on any key historical events that define what the country is. Instead, it defines its nationalism through the spirit of the people. Even more so, tribal nationalism denied any common origin with other nationalities. They said their common people were of a single origin that was superior to all other people. According to Arendt, this new tribal nationalism was mostly abundant in Eastern Europe, and it marked a time when people would distinguish themselves as their group and then the other group, where the other group was always the enemy. It was a one versus all. Quote, "It claims its people to be unique, individual, incompatible with all others, and denies theoretically the very possibility of a common mankind long before it used to destroy the humanity of man." According to Arendt, tribal nationalism acted as the driving force behind continental imperialism. This nationalism was antagonistic of other nationalisms, like nationalisms that basically adhered to the idea of the nation state. In order to understand this better, let's take a little deep dive into what a nation state actually is. The nation state consists of two parts, of course, the nation and the state. Nations, according to Arendt, depict the kind of common origin of the people, kind of a common history that everybody shares and belongs to. The state, on the other hand, emerged out of the kind of past authoritarian rule of monarchies and constitutional governments, and their role was to basically prescribe and execute the laws. However, according to Arendt, there was a hidden conflict that existed between the states and the nation. The states acted on laws in order to create equality amongst all people, regardless of your nationality. The people of the nation, however, wanted special privileges because they were the people of the nation. They are where the nation came from in the first place. And this is a good question in general. I mean, what does it mean to be a part of a country? Does it mean being part of a historical past, of a common people that speaks a common language? Or is it basically being a part as a citizen that is a law-abiding citizen that also works with the government in a way that continues the strength and power of the government? Well, in this particular circumstance, nationalism and the nation side won the argument. Quote, "The tragedy of the nation state was that the people's rising national consciousness interfered with these functions. The state, which was responsible for the laws, was transformed as an instrument for the nation. The state was no longer responsible for making laws for all of the people, but for making laws with a bias for those who were a part of the nation." According to Arendt, this overtaking of the nation accelerated the decline of the monarchy. Now, the monarchy was important because the people of the country felt a special connection with the country through the monarchy. It was an individual relationship to the country. However, with the monarchy gone, the people would need to look elsewhere for a unifying concept of the people. It is at this time that the idea of common origin, or tribal nationalism, sprang. Quote, "The practical outcome of this contradiction was that from then on, human rights were protected as enforced only as national rights, and that the very institution of a state lost its legal, rational appearance, and could be interpreted by the Romantics as the nebulous representative of a national soul, which was supposed to be beyond or above the law." So nationalism is the perversion of the state, where it uses the state as an instrument and a citizen becomes a part of a nation. It was this element during times of social atomization that binded the people together into a single unified nation. And according to Arendt, native citizens looked down on natural citizens. And we can still see this concept today in modern America with the antagonism against immigration. According to Arendt, tribal nationalism introduced the idea that your nation or your home is not any single one country, but where the people of your nation live. Leader of the pan-German movement, Schoner, said, "It is our distinction that we do not gravitate toward Vienna, but gravitate to whatever place Germans may live in." So we have continental imperialism, we have tribal nationalism, and when we combine the two, according to Arendt, we get pan-movements. Pan-movements, according to Arendt, combine the desire for expansion that imperialists want and the desire for racial superiority that tribal nationalism wants. Each Pan movement was based on a single nation. So there was the Pan-Slavs, there was the Pan-Germans, and each Pan movement wanted and sought to see the unification of its people under a single nation. The Pan-Slav and Pan-German movements saw its most fertile soil in Austria-Hungary, where there was a mix of populations and different ethnicities. No one single nation basically ranked supreme in this country. It was in this country where people didn't have any single unifying element that they felt rootless and most socially atomized, and this is why the Pan movements were so abundant here. Quote, "There is in political geography no Germany proper to speak of. There are kingdoms and grand duchies and principalities inhabited by Germans, and each separately ruled by an independent sovereign with all the machinery of state. Yet there is a natural undercurrent tending to a national feeling and toward a union of the Germans into one great nation, ruled by one common head as a national unit." So they didn't have any historical national emancipation to unify around, but they did have one thing to unify around, and that was language. Basically, your home was where your language was spoken. In 1867, the Austria-Hungary government signed into law the Basic State Act. This said, all races of the empire have equal rights, and every race has an inviolable right to the preservation and use of its own nationality and language. In those territories in which several races dwell, the public and educational institutes are to be so arranged that without applying compulsion to learn a second country language, each of the races receives the necessary means of education in its own language. But this wasn't enough for the Pan-German and Pan-Slav movements. They sought the dissolution of the Austrian-Hungary Empire itself. The Slavs requested help from Russia, which was mostly a Slavic nation at the time. During the Crimean War in 1853, Russian folklore writer and Pan-Slav Michael Pagodin wrote a letter to the Tsar in which he said the Slavs people was Russia's only reliable, powerful allies. The Pan-Germans, on the other hand, sought help from Bismarck, who had unified Germany in 1871. But this unification didn't include the Germans that dwelled in Austria-Hungary at the time. Despite the Pan movements reaching out to the countries that they wished to be a part of, these countries still wanted to obey the national boundaries, and thus were even slightly embarrassed by the proposals. Quote, "The hallmark of the Pan movements was that they never even tried to achieve national emancipation, but at once, in their dreams of expansion, transcended the narrow bounds of a national community and proclaimed a folk community that would remain a political factor even if its members were dispersed all over the world." According to Arendt, the Pan movement's antagonism towards the state can be most represented in its modernity by their stance and newfound stance towards anti-Semitism. Now, we discussed previously how the Jews were seen as kind of this mystical people who worked behind the scenes and pulled the strings behind the state machinery, and thus they were seen very close to the state. They were also seen as foreign oppressors, since they weren't part of the nation itself, they came from another land. Thus, they were the perfect target for Pan-Germans and Pan-Slavs to attack. The leader of the Austrian Pan-German movement, Schroeder, said, "We Pan-Germans regard anti-Semitism as the mainstay of our national ideology." Schroeder attacked the Jews as agents of the Habsburg monarchy, and he very easily discovered that propaganda against the Jews was very efficient at gaining the mob into a single arena. Similarly, the Pan-Slav Russian writer Vasily Rozanov wrote that there is no problem in Russian life in which, like a comma, there is not also the question how to cope with the Jew. So the Jews were connected to the state, but there was a more ideological tension between the Pan movements and the Jewish people, and that was the idea of chosenness. Now, the Jewish religion says that the Jews were the chosen people by God. The Pan movements also said that they were chosen by God, so you can see that there will be an ideological conflict. The Slavs found their chosenness in looking back to the Holy Russian Empire, and they asked the Tsar to even lead their movement towards establishing this old divinity. Similarly, the Pan-Germans claimed divine chosenness as well, and Hitler is quoted saying, "God the Almighty has made our nation. We are defending his work by defending its very existence." Now, this conflict of chosenness is different from previous anti-Semitism. Previous anti-Semitism was usually based off of specific events, like the Dreyfus Affair, where there was a specific event where Albert Dreyfus was condemned for treason, and that was basically a center point where people could kind of lash out with their anti-Semitism. This chosenness, on the other hand, is more kind of mystical and mythical, that isn't based in any historical event. It's ideological in nature. Now, the idea of chosenness is based on the Jewish religion, and it was based on the idea that God created man, and that's where chosenness came from. In this sense, all people were chosen as long as they recognized the fact that God was their creator. Tribal nationalism perverted this concept of chosenness. It was not that God created them, but God created a superior race to rule all the other weakened races. Even more so, the Jews had already established what the Pan-Germans and the Pan-Slavs wanted. They had a race that was amongst many different nations and was perceived, at least, as controlling the world for world domination. Quote, that the Pan movement's fanaticism hit upon the Jews as the ideological center constitutes one of the most logical and most bitter revenges history has ever taken. Arendt says that Pan movements also attacked liberal individualism, where your kind of value as a person didn't come from your being a part of a religion or given to you by God, but it was your membership to a movement that basically gave you authority. Quote, the more people know about one another, the less they want to recognize other peoples as their equals, the more they recoil from the ideal of humanity. So all these different tribes had their own nationalism, and each thought they were all superior to the other, thus led to this idea of tribal isolationism. The result of tribal isolationism led to a lack of responsibility. Since there were things that happened, we could no longer assume that it was our responsibility, but we could put it on other tribes. Quote, we know our people, its qualities, and its shortcomings. Where does it begin? Where does it end? That we are supposed to love because it belongs to mankind? Are the decadent or half-bestial Russian peasants of the Mir, the Negro of East Africa, the half-breed of German, Southwest Africa, or the unbearable Jews of Galatia and Romania, all members of mankind? One can believe in the solidarity of the Germans people. Whoever is outside the sphere does not matter to us. According to Arendt, tribalism and racism are merely a way to escape responsibility for one's deeds. So how did tribal nationalism actually become itself? Well, according to Arendt, there were certain body politic structures in place that eventually led to the emergence of tribal nationalism. According to Arendt, the Russian bureaucracy basically oppressed certain nationalities. Thus, those nationalities wanted to become more acknowledged, and hence they had to unify around some kind of concept in order to gain power. In Austria-Hungary, there were many nationalities, and each one was vying for power. Thus, they were always acting against one another. In both instances, there was antagonism against the state as basically the element that was preventing that nationality from becoming itself. Naturally, these nationalities, like the Slavs, thought of themselves as above the state or as stateless people. And the Pan-Germans insisted that the only permanent factor in the course of history was people and not the state. Quote, if tribal nationalities pointed to themselves as the center of their national pride, if they believed that some mysterious inherent psychological or physical qualities made them the incarnation not of Germany but Germanism, not of Russia but of the Russian soul, they somehow knew that the Jewishness of assimilated Jews were exactly the same kind of personal individual embodiment of Judaism. Now, in order for tribal nationalism and continental imperialism and these pan movements to succeed, they needed to get beyond the state somehow. In countries in Eastern and Southern Europe, where there were no constitutional governments, but governments by decree, these were basically vulnerable for taking. Power in these countries wasn't held by a simple system of laws, which was permanent. Instead, it was held by these ephemeral decrees that would be sent out from some authority. And the people in these countries preferred it that way. Pan-Slavs said that they didn't want to deal with rule by laws because it was too slow. They preferred bureaucracy, where the administration rules by these kind of decrees that are sent down to the people. In these countries, parties played insignificant roles, and the parliament had basically no legislative function. In political bodies that are ruled by decree, the government both legislates and executes the law. This is different in constitutional governments like the United States, where you have one body that legislates and another body that basically interprets the law. Now, there is one downside to having things separated like this, it's just much more slower. You have to have more people agree on the laws before they're enacted. However, in systems of rule to decree, there's only one single person that basically says what is right and what is wrong and what happens. Even more so, the decrees don't need any justification. They are basically just sent by some power. And the decrees are created in some kind of anonymous vacuum. No one really knows where they come from, but they must be abided by. In a sense, there's no rule that the decrees need to abide by except the fact that there's no rules. Quote, people ruled by decree never know what rules them because of the impossibility of understanding decrees in themselves and the carefully organized ignorance of specific circumstances and their practical significance in which all administrators keep their subjects. According to Arendt, this form of bureaucracy found its legitimacy in Austria-Hungary and Russia, where there was an atmosphere of secretness and arbitrariness. Quote, since the people it dominates never know why something is happening and a rational interpretation of laws does not exist, there remains only one thing that counts, the brutal naked event itself. According to Arendt, only the Russian Empire offered a complete picture of this bureaucracy. Quote, the chaotic conditions of the country, too vast to be ruled, populated by primitive peoples without experience in political organization of any kind, who vegetated under the incomprehensible overlordship of the Russian bureaucracy, conjured up an atmosphere of anarchy and hazard. This resulted in the idea that freedom in Russia is not about not about being able to put forth laws and have them be judged and justified in certain ways, but freedom meant doing whatever you thought was right. This is different from like the French constitutional government or the United States, where freedom meant being protected by the laws that are agreed upon by multiple groups of people. A Russian writer once said that Panslavism engenders an implacable hatred of the West, a morbid cult of everything Russian. The salvation of the universe is still possible, but it can come about only through Russia. Thus, Pan movement saw bureaucracy as the model institution for rule. The Panslav Pogodin says, a tremendous machine constructed after the simplest principles, guided by the hand of one man, which sets it in motion in every moment with a single movement, no matter which direction and speed he may choose. So who rules these bureaucracies? Well, it's important to note that they come about by movements and not parties. According to Arendt, parties are based off of class interests, while movements are embodiments of ideologies. For example, Arendt claims that Panslavism tried to reconstitute Hegel's idea of progress to the absolute by saying that simply by being a part of Panslavism, by being a member of it, you were the embodiment of the ideal progression of history. It's this idea of the absolute and progress that ideologies have that Arendt thinks is the most distinct between a party and a movement. Quote, all that matters is embodied in the moving movement itself. Every idea, every value, has vanished into a welter of superstitious, pseudoscientific eminence. Now, in order to understand the distinction between movements and parties a little bit more, we have to look at the parties that existed in Great Britain versus the parties that existed in continental Europe. Arendt finds this curious because Britain was the only country in Europe that didn't really fall victim to the Pan movements, and she believes that this is the case because of their own party system. Now, what makes Great Britain different from the continental countries is that Great Britain had a two-party system versus the continental countries had a multi-party system. In a two-party system, you have two choices, and when the party wins the election and the government, they become the state for a temporary period of time. The continental multi-party system, on the other hand, had the state above all of the parties, and the parties were basically acting for their own interests. Now, the advantage of the two-party system is that when the party becomes the state, it chooses its best members of the party in order to kind of execute the chairs of the government. On the other hand, in the multi-party system, everybody shares in the kind of running of the state, and thus the people who run the state are chosen by alliances between the parties, and thus really don't choose the best people to run the country at all. Quote, it is true that a party is only part of a greater whole, never this whole itself. It must never identify itself with the whole, the people, or the state. Therefore, a party may fight against other parties, but it must never ignore them, and usually must not want to destroy them, No party can exist all by itself. So this is basically the embodiment of the Continental Party system. It's also important to state that in this multi-party system, since no single party is running the state, each party doesn't feel fully responsible for what happens. According to Arendt, the chief difference between British and Continental parties is that the British parties act in concert in order to act at all, while the Continental organization of private individuals want their interests to be protected against interference. Quote, "The point is that such nationalistic deformation was almost inevitable in a system that created political parties out of private interests, so that the public good had to depend upon force from above and the vague, generous self-sacrifice from below, which could be achieved only by arousing nationalistic passions." So the Continental parties were defined by some kind of particular interest, whether that be economic, cultural, language, whatever. Parties in Great Britain, on the other hand, were defined through principles that sought the kind of natural and future benefit of the country itself. Party is a body of men united for promoting, but their joint endeavor for national interest upon some particular principle in which they are all agreed. So let's take a look back at these pan movements that came about in continental Europe and why they were basically so influential at the time. There was a distrust in the state and the parties, and thus the pan movements wanted to battle the state, and thus the way they did this is that they identified themselves not as parties. They weren't conflicting for any one particular interest, but they were a movement that was going to take over the state itself. Imperialist groups claim to be above all parties and stand far removed from the strife of parties that represent only a national purpose. In a publication by the Pan-German League in 1918, it states, "Standing outside of all organized political parties, we may go our purely national way. We do not ask, are you conservative? Are you liberal? The German nation is the meeting point upon which all parties can make a common cause." Thus, the rise of the pan movements was complemented with basically the decline of the parties. And according to Arendt, the actual destruction of the party system in continental Europe can be attributed to these pan movements and totalitarian movements. Quote, "When the World War ended in defeat, we met Germans everywhere who said they were outside all parties, who talked about freedom from parties, who tried to find a point of view above parties, a complete lack of respect for parliaments, which at no time have the faintest idea of what is really going on in the country, is very widespread among the people." According to Arendt, the predisposition of movements in continental Europe was due mainly to the fact that the citizens were farther removed from the sources of power. They were in bureaucratic countries, where power transcends the capacity to understand the rulers. And according to Arendt, by the end of the 19th century, the constitutional parliaments declined to the degree that they were perceived as expensive and unnecessary institutions. Each party or movement claimed to be above all the other parties, and they were not satisfied until they had their hands on the state machinery. According to Arendt, this is exactly what happened in Italy with the rise of Mussolini and the fascist party. Quote, "The fascist movement, a party above parties, because it claimed to represent the interest of the nation as a whole, seized the state machine, identified itself with the highest national authority, and tried to make the whole people part of the state. But what prevented the fascist government of Italy and Mussolini from becoming totalitarian governments, which we'll get into later, is that they stopped once they seized power of the state. They didn't ask for anything more after that. Totalitarian movements, on the other hand, don't see the state as an end in itself, but they see the state as another means towards movement, basically continuing to actualize the ideology from which the movement is based. And totalitarian governments like the Nazis saw the state as something that needed to be destroyed in order for them to basically realize their supremacy. Totalitarian movements, according to Arendt, are best exhibited by their relationship to the army, where a fascist movement will basically use the army as a way for keeping the state together. The Nazis subjugate the army and use it as an instrument in order to actualize their ideological movements, activities, and decrees. And thus we're getting closer to totalitarianism. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. It was definitely a long one, and I hope this made sense. We'll come to chapter 9 in probably a week. Hope you have a good day. Thanks.